Hello everyone, and welcome to Diplomatic Briefing. In recent years, the US and the West have often gone out of their way to hype up the so-called China threat, portraying China as the biggest future threat to countries around the world, especially ramping up this narrative for those nations that follow Western-style political systems. At the end of the day, it's really just that the West can't stop China's rise, so they're trying to stir up bloc confrontation to counterbalance China. However, a recent survey by the Pew Research Center shows that even American public opinion towards China is undergoing a subtle but significant shift. For the first time in 5 years, the proportion of Americans holding negative views of China has actually decreased. On August 3, Professor Hickel from the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology in Barcelona, Spain, and Dr. Sullivan, an adjunct fellow at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Macquarie University in Australia, published a commentary arguing that over the past 20 years, the US attitude towards China has shifted from economic cooperation to open hostility. American media and politicians keep making anti-China remarks, while the US government imposes trade restrictions on China and carries out military buildups near China. At the same time, the US still wants people to believe in the so-called China threat. The article states that while China's rise does indeed threaten US interests, it is not as the American political elite describe. China is constantly demonstrating the responsibility and commitment of a rising power, often acting as a messenger of peace to resolve disputes and bridge differences. In contrast, the US often appears as a creator of conflict, spreading war, and stirring up confrontation around the world. The author believes that China-US relations need to be understood within the context of the capitalist world system. Core countries, usually referred to as the Global North, accumulate capital by relying on cheap labor and resources from peripheral and semi-peripheral countries, that is, the so-called Global South. This arrangement is crucial for ensuring high profits for multinational corporations that dominate the global supply chain. In the past, China was the main source of labor for Western companies, with much of Apple's production, for example, relying on Chinese labor. However, over the past 20 years, wages in China have also risen significantly. Around 2005, labor costs per hour in China's manufacturing sector were lower than in India, at less than $1. In the following years, China's hourly labor costs rose to over $8, while in India, they only increased by about $2. The article points out that China's wage levels have already surpassed those of other developing countries in Asia, marking a significant historical development. The rise in labor costs is a positive change for Chinese workers, but it poses a serious problem for Western capital. It limits the profits of Western companies operating in China or relying on Chinese manufacturing for intermediate parts and other key inputs. In addition, whereas China previously had to export large quantities of goods to obtain necessary imports, now China's terms of trade have improved significantly. As the prices of Chinese exports have risen and imports from the US have shown a downward trend, this has greatly reduced the ability of countries in the global north to extract profits from China. The author believes that, for all these reasons, capitalists in the global north are now eager to take measures to restore their access to cheap labor and resources. One option increasingly promoted by Western business media is to shift industrial production to other regions in Asia where wages are lower. But this approach is costly, involving production losses, the need to hire new workers, and other supply chain disruptions. Another option is to force wages in China to fall. Therefore, the United States is trying to weaken the Chinese government, undermine its stability, and disrupt China's economy, including through economic warfare and military threats. The article argues that the rapid development of Chinese technology is also one of the reasons for the United States' hostility toward China. China now has the world's largest high-speed rail network, manufactures its own commercial aircraft, and leads the world in renewable energy technology and electric vehicles. China is also at the forefront in fields such as medical technology, smartphone technology, microchip production, and artificial intelligence. The technological achievements coming out of China are dazzling. The author says that these are accomplishments we usually only expect from high-income countries, but China has achieved them, which is unprecedented. China's technological development is breaking the West's monopoly and could provide other developing countries with alternative suppliers of essential goods at more affordable prices. This poses a fundamental challenge to the West's unequal exchange. The article says that the U.S. has responded to this challenge by imposing sanctions aimed at undermining China's technological development, but so far, these measures have not been very effective. If anything, what these measures have done is increase China's motivation to develop its own technological capabilities. With this weapon basically ineffective, the U.S. now wants to export war, wants to go to war with China, not because China poses any kind of military threat to the American people, but because China's development harms the interests of imperial capital. The author states that the Western narrative about China posing some kind of military threat is pure propaganda and is completely different from the actual situation. The article concludes by stressing that the real reason the West is stirring up war is because China is achieving independent development, which is undermining the imperialist structure that Western capital accumulation depends on. The West will not easily let global economic power slip from its grasp. After seeing the Western scholars' interpretation, let's take a look at a real story of how China helped a developing country overtake others by taking a shortcut. Because Nepal is a small mountainous country, exhaust emissions from vehicles like buses, motorcycles, trucks, and taxis have always troubled the local people, worsening the country's air pollution problem. But now, Nepal is actively pushing for transformation. In the past year, electric vehicles accounted for 76% of all passenger car sales in Nepal, and half of all light commercial vehicle sales. The Nepalese government is seeking to reduce its reliance on imported fossil fuels and improve air quality. Advanced electric vehicles from China have strongly driven this process forward. According to Nepalese customs data, nearly 70% of the electric vehicles Nepal imported last year were made in China. In 2015, after Nepal and India had a dispute over border issues, India tightened its border controls, causing Nepal's oil imports to plummet. To address the energy issue, the Nepalese government subsequently made major investments in hydropower and power grid infrastructure, gradually providing the public with affordable and clean electricity. To fully tap into the potential of electricity, Nepal needs to apply it to transportation. However, in Nepal, where the economy is not well developed, electric vehicles are still too expensive to become widespread. Therefore, the Nepalese government has employed a range of policy tools to provide incentives for electric vehicles. For example, in 2021, the total tariff and excise tax rate for electric vehicles was set at 40%, while the total tax rate for fuel vehicles was as high as 180%. The government is also vigorously building charging stations. Initially, car dealers in Nepal were skeptical about electric vehicles, but they soon saw the potential in them. Amulya Shrestha was originally a distributor of BYD's solar power equipment. When he visited BYD in 2016, he noticed their electric vehicles, and a few years later, he became a distributor of BYD cars in Nepal. Shrestha said that back then, many people were promoting fossil fuels, but no one was advocating for electric vehicles. However, after BYD launched models with longer range that could handle Nepal's rugged roads, Shrestha's company began to take off. Now, he owns 18 dealerships and expects to sell 4,000 cars in 2025. Chaudhary, the chairman of the Nepal Automobile Dealers Association, said, "When you talk about models that compete with Tesla, but their prices are only half of Tesla's, doesn't that sound a bit unrealistic?" But for consumers, this is undoubtedly a win-win situation. He's talking about Chinese electric vehicles. Some Indian car dealers in Nepal also admit that it's hard for them to compete with the affordable and high-quality electric cars made by Chinese manufacturers. However, most Nepalese residents still get around on cheap motorcycles or take buses that run on petrol and diesel. If Nepal wants to further tackle its air pollution problem, it needs to find ways to increase the number of electric buses. The Nepalese government has already spent about $22 million to purchase such vehicles. In the past 2 years, the state-owned bus company has already put 41 new energy buses into operation. Chinese companies have also provided support to Nepal in this field. According to reports, in April this year, Raymond Guizhou Bus Service Company, Limited shipped a batch of pure electric buses to Nepal. Dixit, the head of Nepal's state-owned bus company, said that Nepal hopes to build a clean and accessible transportation network. Nepal's efforts to introduce electric vehicles stand in stark contrast to the policies of the United States and Europe. The United States and the European Union are trying to suppress China's electric vehicle industry. For developing countries seeking economic growth without causing severe pollution, Nepal's experience brings new hope. The International Energy Agency estimates that by 2050, there will be an additional 1 billion cars worldwide, with the vast majority located in low- and middle-income countries. How many electric vehicles these countries adopt could affect future levels of air pollution and carbon emissions. After reading these two articles, here are a few observations. First, the reason the US-led West wants to smear China as the biggest threat is not because of military power or overcapacity, but because China has broken the West's monopoly through technology and cost, shattering the myth of Western superiority. Second, China's breakthroughs in new energy have created opportunities for developing countries to overtake others on the curve. Third, for smaller countries like Nepal, the sustainability of their tourism resources depends on effective environmental protection. China's affordable electric vehicles have brought them new hope, and when it comes to renewable energy like hydropower and electricity generation, only China can offer such low prices, making it affordable for developing countries. China's investment in building electric buses and charging stations has solved the previous infrastructure bottlenecks that hindered widespread adoption, further deepening its influence in South Asia.